The worst MMOs to ever exist, ever. No, seriously, we've all seen the top 10 MMO lists that pop up every 3 seconds on YouTube claiming to hold some prized new information about a 20-plus-year-old genre, only to be hit with the same list of games you've heard over and over again. Even I've been guilty of this, and I'll probably do it again at some point because those get a ton of views. But what if we take that same formula and flip it on its head? What if we find the worst MMOs ever? Now, Josh Hayes has a whole series on this concept, Worst MMO Ever. I'm a huge fan, and he was a big inspiration for my channel, but tons of the games within the series are actually kinda good. Like, they have their downsides, but he always finds the silver lining. Today, I want to find the actual worst MMOs, and I want to do it with a bit of science. So I formulated a scoring system using Metacritic and Steam reviews, average concurrent player counts and peak player counts, general online sentiment, everything from obscure forum posts to Reddit activity, and on top of that, the general budget, profitability, and lifespan of said MMO. Using all of these metrics, I think I may have found 9 completely objectively 100% awful performing MMORPGs. Some of these I've never even heard of, and some of them might have been up to some shady business. Now, just as a quick disclaimer, these MMOs are what I would consider to be your traditional MMO, meaning they're not mobile games. They operate in a shared persistent world where you create some sort of character that you control and progress with through gameplay. These games were marketed as and were widely considered to be MMOs during their release. I excluded early access games or games that were never released, and I'm gonna be completely honest, until today I hadn't even heard of most of these. But some of what I found just might shock you. So, kicking things off at number 1, The Matrix Online, an MMO based on the Matrix movies, obviously. Now, this game is no longer playable, however, there does exist a version where you can explore the entire world, though you can't interact with anything. It launched in March of 2005, and this game was exceptionally poorly received. Part of that was due to the fact that it was released the year after World of Warcraft, but another part is that this game was absolutely filled with bugs and technical issues. And honestly, there's probably a deeper discussion to be had here. I think setting and theme and world are much more integral to an MMO success than people tend to think. It's pretty rare we see really successful MMOs outside of the medieval fantasy theme to begin with. And the ones that are successful tend to be space-themed or otherworldly science fiction. The Matrix is more of a steampunk science fiction. It takes place on Earth and in a modern sort of cityscape that, honestly, we've just never seen many other MMOs thrive in. The only other one I can even think of might be City of Heroes. The game had a pretty complex and hard to understand user interface that's also a lot more common in sci-fi MMOs, and the game wasn't really able to capitalize on its origin IP. One crazy thing I learned about The Matrix Online is that the storyline from the movies canonically continued within this game, and that was widely considered to be canon at the time. At least until 12 years later, when this became a little bit more ambiguous with the release of the film Matrix Resurrections, which promptly and completely ignored everything from the MMO. Overall, the game saw poor reviews pretty much across the board. The online sentiment was not very favorable, and it only lasted about 4 years. We have no official source or numbers on its peak player counts, but in its final days in 2009, it was only averaging around 500 players per day. Though it's often fondly remembered these days online, it's mostly people donning rose-tinted goggles, because trust me, people generally held an uninterested or even negative disposition towards the Matrix Online when it was actually active. Now, that's the best case scenario on the list. It's only downhill from here. Let's keep it moving. Next up, we have Earth Eternal. Now, this was a 2009 browser-based MMO, which at the time were all the rage. If you could successfully pull off a browser-based MMO, this would increase your accessibility to a massive degree, because then people with just normal family computers or people playing at school could hop on at any time, hence the popularity of RuneScape. But Earth Eternal was not a browser-based game. Well, it was, but it required a download, and you had to install things to your PC in order to get it to function, which massively reduced said accessibility. And so people felt like this game was falsely masquerading as a browser-based, fully accessible game like RuneScape, when that wasn't really the case. Furthermore, the company who created Earth Eternal, Sparkplay Media, basically provided very little or slow updates with incomplete features, tons of server issues, and repetitive gameplay loop. And that's coming from people who are used to doing WoW fetch quests and grinding 99s in true old-school RuneScape. But ultimately, this led to Sparkplay running out of money and filing for bankruptcy almost exactly 1 year after the game's initial launch. Apparently, the lore within this game was like insanely extensive, including a 140 plus page PDF document setting up back history and extensive story, much more than plenty of other MMOs at the time included. And the worst part is the game actually doesn't look that bad considering the time frame of its release. I could totally see myself playing this when I was 13 or 14 years old. But it was just completely mishandled, and with a slow, painful 2-year death, the game was finally closed in 2011. It's important to note that Earth Eternal is technically still playable through its fan-made private server Terra Eterna. It's one of the very few games on this list which remains still playable. So, if this video gets 3,000 likes, I'll do a deep dive into the private server of Terra Eterna. Anyway, moving on. We have Alganon. This is the single, most obvious and blatant WoW clone that I've ever seen in my entire life. It's actually shameless. So, Alganon is an MMORPG released by Quest Online in 2009. This is 5 years after World of Warcraft was released, and it was during the prime time of the WoW clone era, where basically every game was being accused of being a WoW clone. Now, it's up to you to decide. Some of these games definitely took a lot of inspiration from World of Warcraft, but none quite as much as Alganon. This game received some of the worst Metacritic and online sentiment across this entire video, because it was quite literally World of Warcraft from Wish, or whatever the Wish equivalent was in 2009. With over 212 mostly negative Steam reviews, an overwhelmingly negative score on Metacritic, widespread negativity in many online forums, both featuring critique towards the game's near plagiarism, as well as critique toward its very controversial lead developer, Derek Smart. This guy would apparently beef with people on online forums about Alganon regarding its monetization, which included but was not limited to a subscription, pay to win, in the sense you could pay real money to learn skills above your level, and plenty of microtransactions. So it's quite surprising then to learn that the game actually had a decent lifespan, lasting almost a decade before it shut down in 2017. And that lifespan is really its only redeeming factor within this list, as it lasted far longer than most other games featured. Either way, this game stands as a testament to the fact that just creating a bad game might get you some negative reviews, but straight up copying other games, that's going to get you some vitriol. Next up, we have Auto Assault, which I find is kind of a funny name because it's synonymous with vehicular manslaughter. And honestly, that's a pretty accurate description of what this game was. Now, Auto Assault was an MMO released by, believe it or not, NCSoft in 2006. You mostly drove around in cars or tanks or bikes, but you could sometimes enter safe zones where you could leave your vehicle. I imagine the developers basically saw the success of Twisted Metal and thought, what if we turned this into an MMO? And that's exactly what they did. I think what happened here is a clear-cut case of this game just simply being overall, altogether, way too niche. Like, imagine trying to explain this to a friend. Alright, listen, it's World of Warcraft, but you're a car, and did you play Twisted Metal on the original PlayStation? Remember how those cars would race and shoot each other, and they were super cool? Well, it's like that, but with friends. Unfortunately, the game never saw any meaningful rise in popularity, leading to a very short lifespan of just 16 months. It closed in August of 2007, and despite that, many people seem to remember this game fondly. Though in plenty of the reviews I found, it seems like these people were few and far between, as they often remembered having to defend the game against critics even during its release. That, on top of your typical technical issues from performance to glitches and bugs and server issues, and coupled with the super low subscriber base, meant the company was losing money hand over fist. Especially considering the game reportedly cost tens of millions of dollars in developmental costs. And ultimately, that's why they had to close the game so quickly. But this is one I definitely want to find a private server for, because it's gotta be one of the most unique MMO experiences. You're probably never really gonna see something like this again, but ultimately, it wasn't meant to be. So moving on, we have Fury, the first MMO on this list to have had a commercial release which lasted less than 1 full year. Fury was an almost entirely PvP-focused MMO with very little to no PvE content whatsoever. Released in October of 2007, people said this game was poorly optimized with a ton of lag and crashes. There was a bloated skill system with tons of redundant and useless abilities. The UI and gameplay was chaotic and hard to follow or understand, and it was released as buy-to-play, but very quickly switched to a free-to-play model, which introduced a ton of pay-to-win. And overall, you can't have a PvP-based MMO that lacks players. People would reportedly stand around for hours and hours waiting for content to participate in because the player base and popularity of this game was just too damn small. With most of the other games on this list, it seems like there was at least a small sect of players who enjoyed themselves, but the complaints for Fury are basically non-ending. No one liked this game. Even the more dedicated players seem to have tons of complaints, and the worst part is they shut down the game abruptly with hardly any notice just 279 days after its initial release, which obviously left a pretty sour taste with the small amount of remaining players. So Fury didn't really have one defining feature that made it suck. Rather, it was just an amalgamation of suckiness, from release to its final day. Literally no one liked this game. It was almost unanimously critiqued, and honestly, it makes sense why they shut it down, and so quickly. Okay, we're starting to get into some of our top performers now, or bottom performers. This next one is known as Otherland. Probably one of the most recent releases on this list, Otherland was one of the strangest MMOs to ever be released. It's supposedly based on the popular book series by Tad Williams. Josh Strife Hayes covered Otherlands, and he said, I quote, "It's one of the most maddening MMOs I've ever played." This game reportedly entered maintenance mode basically immediately after its release due to such a low population, yet it still stuck around for quite some time. Otherland was a free-to-play MMO that featured 4 classes where you would enter into a multiverse and travel between dimensions. It honestly looks and feels like AI made this game, but this was much prior to the rise in popularity of AI within commercial products. Though it was released in 2016 and lasted quite a long while before finally shutting down in 2021, its last few years of activity saw an average concurrent player count of 1. One single player online. For years. That's because this game was buggy, directionless, full of glitches, and it also had a bit of controversy as many people accused the developer of purchasing fake positive reviews on Steam and other popular forums. This led to a ton of critique of the game and who actually made it, and that coupled with the exceptionally low player base that lasted for years, on top of the fact that the fans of the book series felt like this was a bastardization of the universe they knew so well, firmly plants it as one of the worst MMOs to be released, especially within more recent years. And finally, we are into the top 3. The bottom 3. The 3 worst MMO releases possibly of all time. We're starting with APB, All Points Bulletin. Not to be confused with its successor, APB Reloaded, but the original APB. One important thing to note is that this game had a budget of over $100 million, a ridiculously high budget for the year 2010, costing more than most WoW expansions costed to develop around the same time frame. And knowing that makes this next fact even worse. This game featured the second smallest commercial release of any MMORPG, lasting a whopping 79 days. Now, APB was essentially attempting to create an MMO version of Grand Theft Auto. Players could choose to be law enforcement or criminals in some fantasy California city. The core game mechanics included driving and shooting, and these were pretty much unanimously hated by the few people who did play the game. The driving was extremely difficult to control, and shooting felt horrible. On top of that, the map was ridiculously small and the game was monetized heavily. You had to pay $50 for the game, and on top of that, you could purchase really powerful weapons for more money, which in a game that was almost entirely PvP meant that people who spent real money were basically just deleting the quote-unquote free-to-play players. Overall, it was a too ambitious MMO trying to capitalize on the GTA hype and trying to be GTA Online before that ever really existed. The tech just wasn't there to support what really is a great idea. And also, this once again sort of falls into that category which we talked about with The Matrix Online. Games that take place in a modern cityscape on Earth just don't seem to fare well as MMOs. But I don't know, comment and let me know if you played the original version of APB. Apparently it was pretty obscure. In fact, comment and let me know if you played any of these games. Most of them, as I mentioned, I'd never even heard of before today. The 2010 version of APB closed just about 2.5 months after its initial release. Though it was acquired by another company and re-released in 2011 as the free-to-play APB Reloaded, which is still available to this day, the 2010 version will go down as one of the largest colossal failures in MMO history. But we are now into our final 2, and reigning in the number 2 spot is an exceptionally obscure MMO with a fairly sad story, honestly. This is Seed, developed by Runestone Games and released in 2006, and featuring comic book-esque cel-shaded graphics. It was basically Borderlands before Borderlands ever existed. Unfortunately, despite scouring the internet, there is so little footage of this game, it's almost impossible to actually show you all of its problems, but I'll try my best. Now, Seed was attempting to be a social role-playing based MMO featuring absolutely zero combat, where players would craft and trade and participate in politics in order to further progress within the game. Basically, everything you could do within Seed required a player base. This is a pretty novel idea, and we've seen successful MMOs follow this strategy later on, but in 2006, this was basically unheard of. So, due to this unique concept, it actually did receive a decent amount of pre-launch signups with over 15,000 people, and that's without ever spending a single dollar on advertising. But because of this and financial concerns, the developers felt pressured to release the game slightly early. and this resulted in a ton of the game's functionality just not working at all. In fact, most of the game's functionality was not working. And that's if you could actually get into the game, because the account creation process, which was done using their website, was completely down for the first few days of its release. Any and all hype this game might have generated basically completely died overnight. The few players who did manage to get into the game reported that there was nothing to do because most functions in crafting didn't work, and the rest of the things that they wanted to do would require other players, and no one else was online. So the game was shut down just a few months later, and Runestone Games filed for bankruptcy that same year. In all of my findings across my entire channel, this one game, Seed, is probably the single most obscure MMO I've ever come across. It was the precursor to role-playing focused games that I had never heard of, and you can still find old forum posts dating back almost 20 years to some obscure Seed role-playing site with 155 registered members. It's easily one of the most interesting internet rabbit holes I've been down, and while Seed was a colossal failure in every metric, it's an interesting time capsule nonetheless. But finally, we're here, with probably, no, definitely, the worst performing MMO by every metric, and it's not even really close. On the 20th of June 2007, Rapid Reality Studios announced the launch of its science fiction MMO game, Phylon. Players could sign up for one of the 3 different factions and fight for control of the planet Anura. However, by the 10th of July 2007, players found that the game had been closed down and its website was deleted without any warning. Phylon had lasted just 20 days, making it the shortest-lived commercial MMO game ever. Now, I've seen people quote quite frequently that APB, which we talked about earlier, holds the record for the shortest confirmed commercial shutdown of any MMO. And while that might be the case regarding more mainstream MMOs, Phylon definitely takes the cake, even according to the official Guinness World Records website. You can still find forum posts of people basically completely flabbergasted that the game was pulled from direct to drive, the website was shut down, and there was no apparent communication. People felt completely scammed as they still had subscriptions to the promised game time. There's really little else known about Phylon and its developers, Rapid Reality. After Phylon's release, they reportedly got into a bunch of legal trouble regarding Phylon. They deleted all their websites and forms of communication and went completely silent. So it seems like they might have been up to something pretty shady, given that to this very day, we still have no clue where or who these developers actually were. They basically made this game, deleted it in 20 days, and disappeared off the face of the earth. Anyway, folks, those are, according to science, the worst MMOs to ever exist. And with that, I wanted to wrap things up with some runner-ups. I'm just kidding. Anyway, folks, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a sub. Those things help a bunch. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. But anyways, I will catch you all in the next one. Later.